sewing since the age of 8 years old, which means I have built a huge stash of scrap fabric. My favorite way to bust that stash is by creating these lovely log cabin quilt squares. They're really great simply because you can just grab any scrap you want. You don't have to worry about color or anything like that, and just throw them together, and they look amazing. We actually just recently made one of these for one of the employees at my quilt shop who left, and we each made one and embroidered our name in the middle, and she loved it so much she cried. So these are a wonderful gift as well. And you don't have to go out and buy a bunch of fabric. You can steal from what you have from your stash. So you can see here that I have a whole stack of 2-inch strips of fabric. And they're just random. There's no rhyme or reason to any of these. They're just what I had in my stash. Some are longer than others, and some I'll be able to use and some I won't. So I'm just going to keep those aside. The thing that you need to start with is a square that is 3.5 by 3.5 inches. This is what will get you started. Now, in this case, I have a fabric with a direction. There's a cat on it, so I know which way is up. It's going to be very important that you know which way is up because you're going to have to turn the block to add each piece. So if you do not have a fabric that you're using that has an obvious direction like this, you can take a pin and just slide it in, and this one's a butterfly. So now I know that this is sideways, right? This is upside down, but this is up. But in our case, we don't need that because I've got a good direction here. We're going to take our first strip. Now, again, you don't have to cut these to size. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to turn this upside down because we're doing the right sides together. I'm going to match the top edges, but as you can see, I'm overlapping on the side here. The reason why I'm doing this is you can see that this is from my stash, so this edge right here is not quite square. So after each strip that we sew to our middle square, we're going to use our rotary cutter and square it up so it looks nice. Now, the other thing I want to talk about is your seam allowance. We are using this 1/4-inch quilting foot. It's very important that you use a 1/4-inch quilting foot. I have tried to use my regular foot and just kind of move my needle over so it's, you know, maybe a 1/4 inch away from the edge of the foot, but the whole thing just kind of turns out wonky. So this is definitely something worth investing in. It doesn't come with a machine you have. It's something you have to special order, but your local sewing supply shop can probably order it in for you. So we'll slip this guy back on here. And I am just going to make sure my raw edges are lined up, and I'm going to slip a couple pins in here. And now I'm going to sew a stitch right down this matching edge. So I'm starting on the fabric piece that is actually kind of overhanging. I want to make sure that I get the whole thing. I'm going to sew past where my block is just a little ways too, just to make sure that I get it. All right, I've sewn all the way across. I'm going to pull this guy out and trim my threads. I like to trim my threads as I go so that I don't make a huge mess. So now we have this piece here. We need to now press it. When you're doing the log cabins, you always want to press away from the center piece. So I'm going to move this guy right over there. I'm just going to set my iron down on top of my center piece, and I'm just going to push away just like that so I can get a nice press on that guy. Once he's pressed, we can trim. I'm just going to take my rotary cutter and my ruler, and I'm going to line this up right on the edge. So not only am I lining my ruler up right on the edge of this guy, so this continues to be a nice straight line, but I'm also using the grids on my rulers to make sure I'm square with the bottom as well. So there are several different methods that you can do as you are doing your strips. And I'll show you those as we're going. So I'm just going to turn it around this way. And we'll line up our ruler, make sure we're square, and then we'll give it a little trim. All right, so now we have our first strip. We're going to turn the whole thing counterclockwise, just like that. I'm going to grab my next strip and I'm going to lay it on there just like this, matching my raw edges. Now, I have a seam right here. I can feel that seam underneath here, so when I pin, it's going to be very important that I pin that seam down. It's possible, because this seam is away, when I send it through the sewing machine, it could flip and go the other way, and then you get a twist in some of your seams. That's not a huge deal. I wouldn't go seam ripping anything out just to fix that, but it is very helpful if you kind of pin that down so that it goes under the machine the way that you've pressed it. So now I've got some pins in this guy, and I'm just going to send him through the machine as well, starting on the little extra edge that's there. Now you'll notice I'm not back stitching when I do this. The reason for that is when I sew another strip to the outside of this, it is going to sew across the seam, like here. I've just sewn this across this seam, so it's just back stitched the end right there of that seam. So that kind of makes your job easier. Since there's a whole lot of sewing and quilting, you don't necessarily have to back stitch when you're putting your pieces together. Now we've got a good press on that guy, so we're just going to do the same thing. I'm going to use my rotary cutter here, line this guy up, give him a nice little chop, turn this guy over, make sure we're nice and square with the other pieces, give that guy a chop as well. All right. So we've got 2 out of the 3. So we started here, you can tell, because we've sewn across this guy and this guy. So if you're ever lost, this guy is the one you just did, and you're just going to turn it counterclockwise, and we're going to grab another piece. This one's pretty chopped up on the end right there, so I'm just going to line it up well out of the way. I'm going to find my seam right here. I'm going to pin my seam so that it doesn't misbehave on me when I'm not paying attention. Going to get a pin across here, and we're going to sew this one as well. Give this guy a press. Now that he's pressed, we'll give him a chop. Now, the other thing I'm doing, now that I've got several squares built on here, not only am I lining up this edge, but I'm also looking to see if this edge is parallel with some of the other ones that I've already done. Because we do something called stack and whack, where you take multiple pieces of fabric, you stack them on top of each other, and you cut them all at the same time, sometimes they're not as precise as they would be if you were doing them singly. So I always like to just check to make sure that maybe one of these is an off angle a little bit, because I don't want my square to start looking like this. I want the lines to be nice and parallel. So I'm just checking this before I cut this, and that looks pretty good, so I can continue on. And turn this guy around. Again, I've got my edge lined up, but I can see I've got a line right here, and it's running right parallel with this piece, so that looks pretty good. I can cut that guy, remove him. All right, so we've got 3 pieces. We've got 1 more to do our first round. So we'll grab another piece, and we're going to line it up just like this. And now we're going to find our seams, and we're going to pin it into place. So now I've got two seams. I've got one coming out here, so I want to make sure and get both of them. So you can see I'm pinning the ends and I'm also pinning the seams once we start to get established. Now we're going to run this guy through the machine. Trim our threads, this extra guy too. Give this guy a little press. Start at the center and press away. This way you don't get any weird folds and you can press right up to that seam. Get a nice crisp seam right there. Okay, I'm gonna do my little lining up of things, make sure everything looks beautiful. Give that guy a chop. Flip this guy around. Make sure I'm lined up in multiple places. Give this guy a chop. All right. Now, if you wanted a smaller block, you would be done. This guy is, let's measure him. He's about 6.5 by 6.5 at the moment. So the nice thing about this process is you can make them as big as you want, okay? If you just wanted to do cute little squares, this is perfect. These are really good for memory quilts too. If you're cutting up somebody's clothing and you don't have a whole lot of their clothing, you can do smaller blocks like this and then just do big white sashing between your blocks. But we're gonna keep going. So we've made it all the way around. We're back upright. Our little kitty face is standing up straight. So we're going to grab our next piece. We want our sheep to go like that. So we're going to flip it over like this. We're going to line those raw edges up and we're just going to repeat. First piece of our next round is done. Let's give him a little press. And then a chop. All right, this is the one we've just done. I'm going to do a quarter turn counterclockwise and add our next piece. Now you'll notice when I am putting these pieces together on here, I'm leaving a little bit of an overhang, but I have most of my extra piece of scrap coming out on the side here. This way, once I cut, I'm throwing them down here into my scrap basket, the ones that are salvageable. So then I can turn around and use them in another square of the same quilt or even in a different quilt. So we'll press this guy open. And when I cut this guy here, after I even him up real nice, I still have a nice size scrap. See, it's plenty big enough to still use in another square. So I'll go ahead and put that in my basket so I can use that later. This way, you don't end up putting anything in landfill. I'm an environmentalist. But you also don't waste any of your fabric, and you can use like the very last little bit of it. This is also great for snowy days when you don't want to drive to the fabric store to buy anything. You can make an entire quilt out of your scrap basket. It's pretty amazing how far your scraps go. So you're just going to continue like this all the way around until you have as many strips or as large of a block as you want. Once you're done sewing all of your pieces together, it is important, however, to make sure that you have an equal amount of blocks on all sides, an equal amount of strips, pardon me, on all sides, so that it becomes square. Now, it doesn't matter what size the square is, as long as all the squares you're making are the same size, it's just important that they're square. So, for example, if I think I'm done right now, you can tell just by looking through my ruler here that this is definitely not square. This is a rectangle. So you want to make sure an end when you have a square. So let's just kind of look at what we've got here. You can tell the sides are uneven. So I have my center block right there. I have 1, 2 strips on the top, 1, 2 on the right, 1, 2 on the bottom, but only 1 on the left. So we need to add another strip on the left. Now, I want to make sure I get all my seams here. It's really important that you line up the edges really nicely too, so they don't fray and come apart. You could get a hole in your quilt. Guess how I learned that one? So really take your time when you're pinning to make sure those edges are lined up very nicely. That way when you give this quilt to somebody, it'll never come apart. All right, so we're going to chop this guy. We're going to make sure and line him up nice. I'm also looking at this one over here. By the way, don't let this grid fool you. I'm not using any of the numbers on here. I'm simply looking at the lines on my ruler and my quilt block. It just so happens that the cutting mat I am using has numbers on it, but we don't need to pay attention to those. All right, so check it out. We're square again, right? So you could use this as your quilt block as well, but we're going to do one more round to make it just a wee bit bigger. So we've got 2 on each side here. That means we need to start at the top again. Our little cat face is up, so we know we're in good shape. We're just going to line this guy up at the top. Get some pins in here so it cannot move around. Stitch this guy down. Give him a press. Make sure he's laying nice and flat. Oh, look how cute those flowers are next to the sheep. Oh, love it. All right. I seem to be having an accidental pink theme going on here. Chop this guy, put him back in the basket. This guy as well. All right, so we just did this strip. Now it's over here. Oh good, we've got some blue coming in here. Get my ruler out of the way. line this guy up right there. Get a couple of pins in him. See how I'm always sneaking down? I always like to pull this end down just to make sure, and then I can scoot it back up. So another little trick when you're lining these up is if you scratch the fabric downwards like this, it will move. Then you can kind of scratch it upward until you know it's lined up and then get a pin in it. That is how we keep all of our raw edges lined up, which is extremely important. Now you'll notice when I'm pulling the pins, I'm pulling them really early when I'm sewing, but my left hand is holding the weight of where the pin was holding the layers together. So as long as I get my left hand on that pin, I can go ahead and pull it. That way it doesn't run into the little 1/4 inch fin that's on the right hand side of your foot that's holding all of the layers, or that's lining up all of your layers on the side of your foot there. So you can pull the pins early. Usually I recommend that you get the needle as close to the pin as possible. However, in this case, because of that fin, it will prevent your pin from going under the foot. So just make sure you're aware that your hand is taking over the duties of holding all the layers together before it goes under the machine, and you'll be just fine. All right, this piece is barely long enough. I'll just go ahead and center it right in there. I'm just going to do a little scratch maneuver here. Make sure everything is lined up. You can see how quickly these blocks come together too. And of course, because this is just the same motion over and over again, it's quite cathartic and it's very quick to come together. There isn't any critical thinking in this project. It's definitely a nice stress relieving project as well. Doing all of the fun paper piecing and things like that with quilting and using the rulers to get everything on point and all that is really very fun. But if you are just not in the mood for anything that technical, this is a fabulous alternative. Personally, I don't care what I'm sewing. I just need to be on my sewing machine at all times. All right, so we're going to clip this guy. And this guy, and then we'll see where we're at. So I have 1, 2, 3 strips at the top, 1, 2, 3 over here, 1, 2, 3 at the bottom, 1, 2. I need one more and I'm done. So we're going to turn this sideways. We just used that one, so we'll toss that one. This one looks like it'll fit. So we'll just lay it across here, matching up our raw edges. Grab a pin in these guys so they don't maneuver around on you. I'm just going to check my seam allowance, do a little scratch. Pull this over here, do a little scratch there. Our last side, press this guy open really nice. And we'll trim our last sides, making sure everything's lined up. Last one. And now you have your quilt block. So this one is 12 by 12. If I put it here, you can see it fits pretty much perfectly in the 12 by 12. Now if you look over here, this piece of fabric is bowing out just a little bit. So when you go to assemble these, I like to just make sure all of those edges are perfectly straight. So you can kind of sit once all your blocks are done and make sure they're all exactly 12 by 12 by trimming off the edges before you put them into a quilt. My favorite thing to do with a log cabin quilt is to put white sashing between all of the blocks, and then I like to quilt diagonally this way through all of the squares and then diagonally this way through all of the squares. You can also use much smaller strips. For example, if you want to make a cute little pin cushion, you can just use teeny tiny little strips to do this same thing. Or if you want to make something bigger like a pillow, you can just keep going if you have longer strips. Obviously you can't get any bigger than 45 wide. Well, I suppose you could if you did the length of the fabric, but that starts to get expensive. But really you could just keep going with this as large as you want. So now that your scrap stash is all busted, it's time to go to the fabric store. Have fun.